tale of Snow White. Once upon a time, in a far-off kingdom, there was a king and queen, and the queen wanted a child. And so she sat down and she said that she would like a daughter. And she imagined this daughter to have hair as black as ebony, cheeks that were blood red, cheeks or lips that were blood red, and skin that was white as snow. And sure enough, eventually the queen had a daughter with hair as black as ebony, lips that were blood red, and skin as white as snow, and the child was named Snow White. And Snow White grew up in this magical kingdom, but sadly her mother died. The king took a new bride, a new queen, and this queen was very vain. The queen brought with her to the castle a magical mirror, and every night she would ask the mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And she would wait for the mirror to reply that in fact she, the queen, was the fairest in all the land. But as Snow White grew up, she became more and more beautiful, and one fateful day the queen asked the mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror, somewhat apologetically, replied that in fact Snow White had become the fairest in all the land. The queen was enraged. She called for one of her woodsmen to come, and she asked the woodsman to take Snow White into the woods, and according to some versions of the story, to cut out her heart and return it to the queen. The woodsman wasn't too happy about this task, but he knew that he had to obey his queen, so one day when Snow White was playing outside, he told her to follow him into the woods, and into the woods they went. Once they were in the woods, and the huntsman withdrew his knife, Snow White was obviously very afraid, and the woodsman found that, in part because Snow White was so beautiful, there was no way that he could kill her for the queen. So the huntsman told Snow White to run far off into the woods, and never to come back. And in order to appease the queen, the huntsman killed a deer, cut out the heart, and returned the heart to the queen. Snow White ran as far as she could. She ran through the woods, not knowing what she was going to do, but she stumbled upon, at one point, a small cottage. She knocked on the door of the cottage, and there was no answer. She made her way through the somewhat unusually small front door of the cottage, and found herself in a cozy space with a fire that had cooled off, a large table where the remnants of breakfast had been left behind, and Snow White, having run for a long time through the woods, but very terrified, found herself quite hungry. She tried to find a comfortable seat to sit in. She tried all of the chairs, finally found one that was the right size, and sat down. Yes, this sounds like Goldilocks, but is in fact also part of the Snow White story. She tried all of the food on the table, and finally found a bowl of porridge that she enjoyed. She went exploring through the cottage, and found a series of 7 small beds. She tried them all, and finally found one that was comfortable. She curled up, and finally fell asleep. Sometime much later, a whistling came through the woods, and into the cottage returned 7 small dwarves, returning from their work in the mines. They had their pickaxes, and their hammers, and their shovels, and into their home they came. It didn't take them long before they noticed that something was amiss. The furniture was moved around, food had been eaten, and eventually they discovered this beautiful woman, young woman, asleep in one of their beds upstairs. When Snow White awoke, she tried to explain to these 7 dwarves what had happened. And the dwarves were aware of the vain and cruel queen who had taken over the kingdom after the death of Snow White's mother, and they took pity on Snow White and said that she could stay with them. And so Snow White agreed to stay, and it looked like things were going to be okay. But of course, the queen still had the magic mirror. And when the queen asked the magic mirror, who is the fairest of them all, the magic mirror replied that, in fact, the queen was the fairest in all the land, but that on the other side of the woods there was another, one who was, in fact, fairer than the queen, one who went by the name of Snow White. The queen was furious, and she realized that her plan to have the huntsman kill Snow White had failed, because Snow White was far too beautiful, far too perfect, far too innocent for that plan to work. So the queen decided that she would prey on Snow White's innocence. And being a very powerful queen, as well as a sorceress, she called upon some black arts, some black magic, and she transformed herself into an old crone. She made her way through the woods, trying to find where Snow White was, and eventually, like Snow White, she came upon the cottage. Now, of course, the dwarves were off at work in the mines, and Snow White was in the cottage by herself, and although she had been warned to be very cautious, Snow White was young and trusting and innocent. And so when there was a knock at the door and she peered out the window and saw a haggard, feeble-looking old woman standing at the door, she decided that it was safe to answer. Snow White opened the door to the old crone. The crone had a basket of apples, and she asked Snow White if she would buy an apple from her. She was very poor, trying to sell these apples. And so Snow White took pity on the old woman and decided that she could spare a coin to pay for the apple. So even though she was a little nervous of this stranger, the apple was so shiny, so perfect, and so delicious looking that Snow White could not resist taking a bite of the apple. So, indeed she did. Immediately, Snow White crumpled to the ground, and the apple was, of course, poisoned. The queen felt that her work had been done. She had finally killed Snow White, and that was the end of the story. So, the queen returned to the castle, very pleased with herself. The dwarves returned to their home and found Snow White crumpled on the ground. She didn't seem to have a heartbeat or to be breathing, and the dwarves were greatly saddened. But strangely, even though she seemed to be dead, the blood-red color had not left her lips or her cheeks. Her skin was still as white as snow, her hair was still as black as ebony, and they decided that she was far too beautiful to bury in the ground. So they constructed a glass case for Snow White, and they placed her on a bed with the glass case covering it, and they took it even deeper into the woods, where they decided that she would lay in a beautiful clearing, and her beauty would remain for all to be seen. So there Snow White remained, and the queen was pleased that in fact she was now the fairest in all the land, as Snow White did in fact seem to be dead. Now, there's various versions of the story as to how Snow White was discovered by a prince riding through the woods one day, but we'll go with the prince comes upon this glass casket in the woods, and he sees this absolutely beautiful young maiden lying in this casket, and because she's still so beautiful, he believes that there's no way that she could be dead, and he feels that this is some kind of magic sorcery that she's been placed in this glass case, and so he decides to remove the glass case, or break the glass case, take it away from her, and he sees this maiden lying there, who's completely still, she doesn't seem to be breathing, but he can't resist her beauty and decides to lean over and give her a kiss. And as he does so, the piece of apple, the bite of the apple that she had taken, falls out of her mouth. And as the apple falls out of her mouth, the apple's poison leaves with it, and Snow White miraculously comes back to life. Of course, in the story, the prince has instantly fallen in love with her, and leads to a happily ever after tale. The queen, upon hearing that Snow White is now once again the fairest of them all, is of course enraged, but Snow White and the prince return to the castle, and Snow White, as the rightful daughter of the queen, the original queen and king, takes her place as the new ruler of the land, and the old queen, the sorceress, is banished, her and her mirror forevermore, from the kingdom. As far as I know, that's where the story ends. So, the end.